Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.
Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling, and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. It is our first show of December. We're getting closer to a new year, if you can believe it. We've got lots to tell you about on this week's broadcast. And starting things off today, planting cover crops can have several benefits for crop producers, including weed and pest prevention, better soil health, and additional nutrients for successive cash crops. Now, the UNL NRCS Soil Health Initiative is taking things to new heights, literally. Through the use of aerial imagery, researchers are learning valuable lessons about cover crop biomass, as well as their potential impact on cash crop growth and development. Market Journal's Bill Dodd has the story.
More and more recently, many crop producers and researchers have been utilizing aerial imagery to study fields in order to make more informed management decisions. While primarily researching how different management systems can impact soil quality, by getting a bird's eye view and utilizing different imagery tools, UNL researchers, with the assistance of Nebraska Natural Resources Conservation Service and on-farm research participants, have been able to glean a slightly better insight into the impacts of specific management practices as it pertains to cover crop production.
In this project, we have imposed treatments, so we can actually see the difference between some of the practices that farmers are using. So again, if that's no cover crop compared to cover crop, or different planting dates with cover crop, different cover crop varieties or different species that they're using, or all those things we can see in a picture over the course of the cover crop growing season as well as into the cash crop growing season. So with these articles, we did two things. One was to compare field measurements that we took of the amount of growth in the field to a vegetation index, the NDVI, to see how well those aligned. And we found that we were able to detect differences between management practices, so differences in cover crop planting dates. Earlier planting dates resulted in more cover crop biomass. We could see that higher NDVI value, or a cover crop that was grazed that had less biomass in the spring compared to no grazing, we could see that difference in NDVI as well. So that's pretty exciting that the imagery can validate what we see on the ground in terms of the amount of biomass aligning with a vegetation index that we've calculated.
Beyond analyzing cover crop growth and management practices, another potential application for this particular imagery practice would also be a better understanding of how much cover crops can impact subsequent cash crops during the growing season.
So we get those images every 1 to 2 weeks during the growing season, and we can see on those treatments what's happening after the cover crop has been terminated. And what we found in one of the farms that we looked at in 2019, one of our collaborators, was really interesting, was that this producer who was growing soybean after a cereal rye cover crop, was that the soybean grown in the areas of the field that had a cover crop, the NDVI value was actually lower than the areas that did not have a cover crop. Okay, so what that indicated to us is that likely the canopy had not closed as quickly in the areas following the cover crop compared to no cover crop. But by the end of the season, that pattern actually flipped, so that the NDVI values were higher in the cover crop, the areas of the field that had the cover crop. So there was some developmental difference with the soybeans following the cover crop and no cover crop. That the soybeans following the no cover crop actually had senesced more quickly. And so that's why there was a lower NDVI value by September. But the very interesting thing was that there was no difference in grain quality or in grain yield. So even though we could see that the cover crop was having some potential effect on the soybean developmentally during the year, that did not lead to any difference in yield.
While the potential applications of this study are exciting, there's still much work to be done when it comes to turning this raw data into a viable management practice or reliable diagnostic indicators.
One
thing to keep in mind is that we are still at the early stages of this project in terms to understand how we can turn that in a management decision. But our first step was to see if with aerial imagery, remote sensing, we could detect both cover crop biomass production and also its effect on the subsequent cash crop. So that was one of the positive aspects that we saw that we could use remote sensing. And then the second question that would be how farmers can apply that information. That's something we are still thinking about it, but how I see in the long-term horizon is, for example, using that information for site-specific cover crop management, for example, the same way as farmers use nitrogen prescription maps. Why we cannot use the same concept for cover crop? But that's something that will take some time, but that's how I see in the long term how farmers can use that information to apply to their fields.
By using a non-destructive and easily applied method of imagery, the study has shown that we're able to develop a better understanding of cover crop biomass production across an entire field. This would be much more difficult with more traditional sampling methods. While there's still much work to be done, the potential applications for this practice are worth keeping an eye on. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Thanks, Bill. If you'd like to learn more about the study and the collaboration between UNL and the NRCS, we've posted links to related articles on the Market Journal website. Let's look at markets now, and DTN's Todd Hultman joined me this week. Todd tells me that holidays can sometimes bring on some odd price movements in the markets, and this year was no different.
Yeah, oftentimes I try to warn our readers that when we get into these holiday times where volume's low and a lot of people just aren't paying attention, you'll see some kind of shenanigans go on in the market. And that happened again right before Thanksgiving this past week. On Tuesday, we saw Kansas City wheat prices run up a dime. And then the next day, I should say, they got hit over 20 cents real quickly. Looking at the volume figures, Tuesday's volume was higher than usual, which is unusual for a holiday week, and suggests to me that somebody was pumping things up. We already knew speculators in the market were on the long side of Kansas City wheat. So I think they got everybody leaning long on Tuesday. And then once again, they came in with bigger volume on Wednesday and hit the market sharply. It's kind of a common manipulation type trick that I've seen for years and years in the market. And as you say, it tends to happen during these times when our attention is elsewhere and people aren't paying attention. So a little crazy stuff people don't often talk about, but markets are prone to games.
Okay, Todd, so you covered wheat for us. What are some of the big stories with corn and soybeans that you're following as we head through December?
Well, Troy, as you probably know, it's very unusual to have this high of corn prices and soybean prices shortly after harvest. I mean, this is a time of year we're usually trying to dig out a hole as far as prices are concerned. And here we have corn trading around $4, March around $4.20, and in January, soybeans around $11.60, $11.65. So what's happened to the market? All of a sudden, China came in as a much larger than expected buyer. It started actually in the summer months and really picked up in the fall. It was a surprise to everybody, especially in this year of coronavirus. We were all concerned that maybe China's demand would be down, but that's not the case. They've been, because of the swine fever situation that they had the past couple years in their hog herd, they've been rebuilding those hogs. They've also been increasing their poultry production aggressively to make up for that pork loss. And those two things, it looks like, have really boosted their demand for our feed grains. There may be some other things going on. And one of the problems with China is it's hard to know what's happening inside the country. It's hard to get reliable information about what's actually happening. But we can look at their domestic prices on the Dalian exchange, and we see corn price very high, above $10 a bushel in China, and soybeans above $15.50 a bushel. So it does look like there is a legitimate shortage of feed grain in that country, and that's really pumped up our exports.
Crazy ride we've been on for sure. Okay, let's keep it international and head to South America real quick. I was reading how the weather Mato Grosso is experiencing is the driest they've seen in over 4 decades. Tell us the ramifications that could have on the soybean market.
Yes, it's been a very tough start. Typically, they get well into their rainy season in September when planting begins, but that got pushed farther ahead this year. And so their planting was later than usual because conditions were so dry. The rainy season did start, it seemed about mid to late October. But even then, the rains that came through haven't really been as plentiful as normal. We're in a situation now where that Mato Grosso province is a real key. It's the #1 producer of soybean state in Brazil. And it's been rather dry there the past few weeks, and their soybeans are starting to get to the flowering stage, so they need moisture. The soybean supply situation right now is legitimately tight. And even if South America has good weather, it's still a very bullish situation. I think the true ending stocks are probably closer to 100 million bushels than USDA's estimate of 190. And in previous times when we've seen ending stocks that low, we're often talking about prices where we could describe beans in the teens or something which sound crazy early this year, but is a very real possibility right now. So then when you add the layer to that of a possible problem of South American weather, it becomes potentially even more bullish. So this will be very interesting in the months ahead for soybeans.
All right, and finally, Todd, we've got lots of folks that are dealing with the best ways to market recently harvested corn. Futures prices are up, as we talked about earlier, and ending stocks are forecast to be lower. Is this the time to think about a new marketing strategy? And if so, what are some things to do?
Yes, well, there certainly are some creative possibilities. Our senior analyst, Dana Mantidi, wrote about one which involves options. Now, I know not everyone's always keen or open to using option strategies. And this particular one, it has to do with buying a put, which gives you downside protection in the market, and also selling a call, which kind of gives you a prearranged sale if you get to a certain higher price. Now, the problem I've had about recommending that in the past is that there is margin requirement involved. And so if the market rallies higher than expected, you can get in a bind there if you're not ready to cover your margin. However, many elevators or co-ops have similar type products that you can find at their cash places where margin requirement's not concerned. So that would be a good place to start, asking them about what we call a fence strategy of buying a put or selling a call. In general, though, I'm a firm believer in, we've got great prices at harvest time, take advantage. I've already recommended selling 75% of the crop, basically just holding that last 25% in case prices get really crazy. And if they do, I think soybeans is the prime candidate possibly this year. But, when you don't have to store and pay the storage fees, why not? Let's take advantage of these good prices.
Next week, we'll be joined by Central Valley Ag's Luke Beckman. If you have a question you'd like for me to ask him, email us or get in touch on social media, and I'll pass your question along. Time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Al, we've made it to the home stretch of 2020. What can we expect in the forecast for the next several days?
Well, Troy, we can't complain about the weather this past week. We really didn't have anything in the way of precipitation. Temperatures during the first part of the week were above normal. Then we've seen the colder air come in. We're going to turn this back to more reality, if I like to call it that, closer to normal to slightly below normal. Now we started to see this general warm up here at the end of the week. Unfortunately, this lack of precipitation is concerning. If you look at this fall period, the last 3 months, basically the western one half of the state, most areas have not received an inch of moisture. So we're not getting any subsoil moisture recharge for next growing season. And even in eastern Nebraska, depending on location, we're running anywhere from 25 to 50% of normal fall moisture. So we're carrying 2 to 3 inch deficits in a lot of locations, and that'll have to be made up at some point in the future. Otherwise, we're going to be compromised as we go into next growing season with insufficient soil moisture and be relying on timely rainfall events the entire summer. And if we have a situation like this year where the warmth and the dryness returns during the second half of the summer, it'll get pretty ugly pretty fast. So Unfortunately, nothing in the way of precipitation this next 7 days, but there are signs from the GFS model that maybe this pattern is finally going to start to rotate more toward an eastern U.S. trough as we move into the second half of the month. That'll give those that want to see snow a little bit better chance of seeing some before Christmas. Those that don't want to see the snow might want to put this book away for a little bit because it is going to come eventually. Let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we got in store. And the first thing I'll draw your attention to is the trough across the east. Cut off a low that was forecasted to be over the central Rockies last week, actually came a little farther south and east. That's going to move slowly to the east. We're under the influence of high pressure, nothing in the way of any significant moisture to deal with. It's going to be a nice weekend. Go out and enjoy it. We're going to be slightly above normal, basically into the 50s. The trough is going to keep the coolest air to the east. It looks like it deepens a little bit as that system moves toward the east and basically absorbs it. But for the overall, high pressure is firmly controlled across the central plains. Nothing in the way of significant moisture. You have to all the way go to the Pacific Northwest to see any significant moisture. Now we do see some cutoff low that'll develop in the southwest, but pretty much ridging dominates the remainder of the northern and central plains. High pressure firmly in control. I think we might even push the 60-degree mark as we get into Monday across portions of the southwest. Now as we go into the day on Tuesday, that trough starts to make inroads into the Pacific Northwest. That's going to shunt that warmer air even farther toward the east. So we're going to see another nice day as we go into Tuesday. Precipitation free. Once again, mid-50s, low 60s looks to be common. Then as we go into Wednesday, that trough starts to make inroads into the central Rockies, pushes that ridge toward the southeast. That's going to start to return some moisture into our region, but not fast enough to generate precipitation on Wednesday as low pressure develops at the surface. You can see pretty much a dry atmosphere being pointed by the GFS model. As we go into Thursday, we see the trough kind of split the energy, some to our north, some to our south. The primary emphasis of heavy precipitation will be with the southern portion of this, and you see most of that is down in the deep bend region of Texas. Pretty much precipitation free in our region. As we go into the later part of the week, that trough deepens. We start to get a bigger surge of moisture, and low pressure starts to form basically in eastern Illinois, and then we have another piece of energy back toward Texas. That's going to start to fill in some precipitation, and there is a hint that we might actually get some snow into southeastern Nebraska. We'll pay attention to this system, but it looks like as we go into next weekend, even more energy will make it into our region, particularly later half of the weekend, and we'll see an increase in precipitation. So the 8 to 14-day forecast is actually picking up on this cold air coming into our region for next Thursday through the following Tuesday, and in terms of precipitation, you can kind of see some of that above normal moisture starting to show in. So overall, Troy, looks like a good week. Precipitation may be developing as we get toward the second half of the month.
Thanks, Al. In past forecasts, you may recall Al talking about wildfires that burned in the western half of the country this year. While the majority are under control, Nebraska agriculture could see the impacts next growing season. Market Journal's Maddie McIntosh spoke with Extension educator Gary Stone to learn more.
As of November 2nd, the National Interagency Fire Center reported over 47,000 wildfires, which have burned nearly 8.6 million acres in 2020. While the majority of the fires were located on the Pacific coast, 2 nearby blazes may cause problems for agriculture in the heartland.
The 2 major fires that could affect Nebraska were the Cameron Peak Fire, located west of Fort Collins. It started about August 13th of this year. It encompassed about 326 acres, and at this point in time, it's about 92% contained. The other fire was the Mullen Fire. It was located west of Laramie, Wyoming. It started September 17th. It encompassed about 276 square miles, and at this point in time, it's about 97% under control.
Smoke drifting into neighboring states was one of the effects producers and communities immediately faced.
Well, as far as the smoke and the haze that it generated, looking at some of the smoke maps that you can bring up on the internet, it affected pretty much all of the state at some point in time. I know here in the Panhandle, specifically around Scottsbluff, Southern Panhandle, there were a few days that you couldn't see maybe 3 or 4 miles. The air quality was very poor. After a few days of that, your throat started to get a little raw and rough, and it was just best to stay inside.
But Gary says smoke might not be the biggest concern. What he worries about most is the effects we have yet to see.
It's going to be what happens in the future. And that is mainly about our water quantity that we'll get next spring. That will all determined by the amount of snowpack that we get in these two areas. Both of these areas are part of the watershed for the North Platte River and the South Platte River. The Mullen Fire probably took in roughly 40% of the Snowy Range, which is on the east side of the North Platte River drainage at the headwaters. So how much snowfall we get, how fast it will melt and come off and fill the reservoirs will be a factor that we need to look at for next spring.
Lastly, Gary says the fires do have a main cause, and we will most likely see more of them in the future.
A lot of this is these fires are due to beetle kill. I wouldn't say it's necessarily due to global warming, but the beetle kill from a number of years ago really decimated a lot of the pine trees in these areas across the Rocky Mountains. And I guess it was just a question of time before we had fires like this that would go in and clear out those dead trees, or at least start to clear them out. There's still a lot of dead beetle kill timber up in those areas, so we can probably look forward to seeing some more fires like this in the future.
Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Maddie McIntosh.
Thanks, Maddie. For more information and to follow the status of the wildfires, you can visit insaweb.nwcg.gov. We'll also post that link on the Market Journal website. Finally today, since Donald Trump was elected, the agricultural focus of his presidency has been about trade. During his term, he withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, renegotiated NAFTA, and of course, battled China on tariffs. But with President-elect Joe Biden set to be sworn in next month, what can agriculture expect with a new person in the White House? I spoke with DTN Ag Policy Editor Chris Clayton to get an idea.
Well, ag policy is like a giant ship. It doesn't really turn on a dime. It's kind of slow to move, and we're still in the middle of a farm bill. We potentially would not get a new farm bill until 2023. So some of those basic core things that farmers are used to would remain the same. I think the big focus and the big change is going to be on conservation programs and renewable energy programs, things that focus on climate change, because that is already, we're beginning to see from some of the things in the transition team that President-elect Biden has put together, a group of people who are focused and oriented on agriculture and climate change.
And then another thing that many of us have been reading about is how Biden's tax plan could impact farmers and people in the ag community. Could you speak on that a little bit for us?
Yeah, his tax plan, particularly focusing on anybody making more than $400,000 of adjusted gross income, would increase taxes on that. It would increase taxes on capital gains. Of course, the big issue here, though, is can he actually get this passed? Another issue, though, that is going to come down the line, and it could come down the line throughout the latter part of his presidency, is something will have to change on the estate tax, because one of the things that happened with the Trump tax cuts is that they extended out to 2025, but then they revert back, which could become even worse. So something is going to have to be negotiated out towards at least the latter part of his term, even if he still has a Republican-led Senate or a full Republican Congress, because of the way that those tax bills were set up in 2018.
And next up, a new president means a new Secretary of Agriculture. So tell us, who are some of the names we could see pop up in the running to replace Sonny Perdue?
Yeah, the names are all over the place. The name that really came up initially and most often so far is former North Dakota Senator Heidi Heitkamp. She lost her re-election race in 2018, but there's been a tremendous amount of pushback by progressive groups already against her. They want to see somebody as much more progressive. They've been pitching Representative Marcia Fudge of Ohio. She is from the Cleveland area, and she's much more focused on the food programs such as SNAP and civil rights issues than maybe perhaps a traditional ag secretary might be. Another name that has come up in recent days is Russell Redding, who is the Secretary of Agriculture in Pennsylvania. But there are like 7 or 8 different names that have been tossed out there right now that are possibilities for that position. So it's still very much up in the air.
What are some things Joe Biden will be looking at that new Secretary of Ag to accomplish?
Well, I think climate issues are again going to be something at the forefront for this administration. It's not just in the Department of Agriculture, but they're looking to really integrate changes throughout. Trade is going to become more complicated because Trade Promotion Authority is set to expire around the middle of 2021. Unless that is renewed, it's going to become a little harder to negotiate trade policies. There's already been some focus, both from Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, though, that one of the things that maybe we need to do as a country to offset the growing influence of China is develop a closer regulatory and trade relationship with Europe. Europe is much more aggressive and focused on these agricultural sustainability issues than we are. And if we're going to get a trade policy going with Europe that's going to be effective for agriculture, that's going to be one of the most difficult things to do, is marry up our agricultural policy with theirs.
Appreciate that insight from Chris. Lots to follow for sure. That's going to do it for this week's show. If you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media so you can join in on the conversation. And don't forget, you can get the latest updates on the coronavirus outbreak at covid19.unl.edu. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.